Servants of Satan. Written by Seabury Quinn. Read for you by Edward E. French. Part 3. Rebecca Nurse, Saint of Salem. The frown of God lay black upon the province of Massachusetts in the spring of 1692. Harvests of the previous summer had been less bountiful than those of other years. Much livestock had died during the severe New England winter, and an expedition against the French in Canada had ended disastrously for the colonists. All these calamities, or any one of them, would have been enough to justify a day of solemn fasting and prayer for divine forgiveness. But terrible as the material misfortunes of the people were, they were nothing compared to their spiritual torment. When crops failed and cattle died, it was understood as a sign of heavenly displeasure, and when the Frenchmen and their red-skinned allies withstood the trained bands of the New Englanders, the god of battles seemed to have withdrawn his favor. And when witchcraft, wild and rampant, spread like a plague throughout Old Salem and its environs, the clergymen and elders of the church felt assured they were entirely forsaken by heaven. The Lord had turned his face from his people, and Satan, who laid cunning traps for the souls of the unwary, was working for the colonists' spiritual destruction, even as the French and Indians sought the destruction of their bodies. No man dared look his neighbor in the face for fear of seeing there the mark of Satan. Salem and Ipswich jails were full to bulging with confessed or suspected witches, and the group of young girls and women who seemed particularly susceptible to malign influences was constantly augmented by new recruits, children and girls who fell into fits, cried aloud in terror at invisible phantoms which mocked them from the air, or fell writhing to the floor, tortured by invisible fingers which pinched them black and blue, or thrust pins and needles into their tender flesh till the red blood spurted from their wounds, staining their clothing and terrifying the beholders. The devil was loose. Everywhere he added to the number of his servants. Soon the entire settlement would lie beneath his dreadful domination. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, poor and friendless old women of Salem village, had been denounced as witches and thrown into jail. Tituba, the half-breed slave of the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, had confessed herself a witch and been sent to Boston to be sold to another master. Giles and Martha Corey, substantial farmer folk dwelling in Salem Farms, where the town of North Peabody now stands, had been cried out against by the afflicted children and lay in jail awaiting execution. Still the tide of devilry ran higher and higher. The children continued to denounce first one, then another of the neighbors as witches, for, it seemed, no sooner was one witch apprehended and lodged in prison than a dozen more arose to plague the people with the magic powers derived from Satan in return for their souls. Cotton Mather, doctor of divinity and eminent Boston preacher, had come to Salem to reinforce the Reverend Mr. Parris in his combat with the evil one, and the force of his sermons stirred the terrorized people to a fever pitch. Not one servant of Satan, not one brand out of hell's fire was to be allowed to remain in the midst of the congregation of the righteous. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, commanded Holy Scripture. Witches and wizards, be they poor, friendless old women, prosperous farmers, or substantial citizens of Salem itself, must be gathered into the meshes of the law's net and dealt with according to the dictates of Scripture. And now a shiver of surprise and incredulity ran through the dwellers of Salem village. Rebecca Nurse, widely known and universally loved wife of Francis Nurse of Salem, had been denounced as a witch by the afflicted children. The farmstead on which the Nurses dwelt had been divided into parcels, Francis and Rebecca Nurse retaining the original home, while such of their 8 children as had married occupied smaller plots adjacent. The family, while not the richest in Salem, was one of the most highly respected and most contented in the neighborhood. Mrs. Nurse herself was a veritable mother of Israel. Nearly every person in Salem was beholden to her in some manner, for she had watched beside their beds of birth and death, nursed them in sickness, and comforted them in sorrow. No one had ever applied to her in vain for aid, No beggar had ever been turned hungry from her door. Her 71 years of life represented 71 years of blamelessness. March 23, 1692, a warrant for her arrest was given George Herrick, Marshal of Essex County, and she was brought before the magistrates to answer a charge of working, quote, certain detestable acts called witchcrafts, unquote, upon Ann Putnam, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams. Ann Putnam, a child of 12 years, was one of the afflicted children who had accused Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne of witchcraft. She was also the original accuser of Martha and Giles Corey of Salem Farms. Abigail Williams was a niece of the Reverend Mr. Parris and a member of his household. Together with the Putnam child, she had been a prosecuting witness in every trial for witchcraft in Salem village. When Rebecca Nurse stood before the magistrate Hathorne to answer the charges brought against her by the children, there were many in the courtroom who felt a grievous error had been made. That saintly old goodwife Nurse should be suspected of witchcraft, of trafficking with Satan, was as unthinkable almost as a similar charge against Mr. Parris, or even the learned Dr. Mather would have been. Yet Magistrate Hathorne proceeded in the same hectoring manner he had used toward all suspects in witchcraft cases, asking the prisoner repeatedly not whether, but why she had injured the prosecuting children. At last, desperate, the old lady extended her hands toward heaven, exclaiming, "I have none to appeal to but God." At this, the afflicted showed every evidence of undergoing violent pains, their screams and howls drowning out the words of the accused. Hathorne determined to remand the prisoner to jail, and the old lady bowed her white head in meek resignation. Immediately the afflicted children were forced to bend their heads forward, nor could they raise them till, at Abigail Williams' entreaty, the marshal roughly forced Mrs. Nurse's head up, whereupon, according to a note made by Mr. Parris, it was observed that Betty Hubbard, her head was immediately righted. June 2, 1692, Rebecca Nurse's trial for, quote, certain detestable acts called witchcrafts, unquote, commenced. The Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, acted as assistant prosecuting attorney, clerk of court, and general factorum. The first witness examined by Mr. Parris was the child, Ann Putnam. "I was grievously tortured by her during her examination," before Magistrate Hathorne in March, and also during the time of her examination, I saw the apparition, i.e. a supernatural spectre or demon duplicate of the accused, which emanated from or returned to her body at will, of Rebecca Nurse go and hurt the bodies of Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams. This deposition we have in the handwriting of Mr. Parris, but whether he wrote it after Ann's testimony or jotted it down as she delivered her evidence, there is no way of telling. At any rate, we find another note, also in the handwriting of the Reverend Prosecutor, which states, quote, "To the same effect were the statements of Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams," unquote. One of the beliefs at the time was that Satan set his seal upon all his servants, that witches and wizards were all branded with the devil's mark. For this reason, it was customary for the court to appoint a jury of the same sex as the accused to make a minute physical examination and report any unusual warts, moles, or growths found upon his or her body. It was thought that the evil one assigned one of his imps to the special service of each of his human servants, the imp assuming the shape of a black cat, an owl, a rat, or some other uncanny-looking creature, and performing such supernatural errands as the witch chose to order. For nourishment, the imp, or familiar as it was termed, sucked the witch's blood, and the spot from which the blood was drawn became insensible to pain. This spot was popularly known as a witch test. Now, it often happens that old persons grow certain excrescences of the flesh not found upon the bodies of younger people, yet these are perfectly explainable by natural causes. Such a growth was found upon the body of Rebecca Nurse by the jury of women appointed to inspect her person, and though 2 of the jury women reported it to be of natural origin, the verdict of the committee as a whole was that the prisoner had been marked by Satan. On June 28, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Thereupon, Mr. Parris records in his notes, there was much anguish among the afflicted. The girls, whose testimony under the skillful questions of the Reverend Samuel Parris had charged Rebecca Nurse with being in league with the devil, rolled upon the floor, shrieking and crying, frothing at the mouth and otherwise giving evidence of unsupportable suffering. Then came the crowning infamy of this infamous proceeding. The judges refused to entertain a verdict favorable to the prisoner. Solemnly they rose and directed the jury to retire and reconsider their verdict. The jurymen filed from the courtroom, debated some time, and returned to state they could not arrive at a verdict other than that already given. The court thereupon ordered them to bring in a verdict of guilty as charged against the accused, which monstrous order was complied with by the overawed jurymen. It must be remembered that persons accused of felony were not allowed the services of attorneys for their defense under the English law of those days. But to compensate for this handicap, the judges were supposed to conserve the prisoner's legal rights in every way. This was their sworn duty, and according to law and to the judge's oath, every reasonable doubt was bound to be resolved in the prisoner's favor. By their action in the case of Rebecca Nurse, then, her judges violated their duty and their sacred oaths as judicial officers, staining their hands with innocent blood and their reputations with infamy for all time. Such a villainous perversion of justice was never before or since committed in an English-speaking court on the North American continent. Sentence of death by hanging was passed upon Rebecca Nurse, but 39 of the most prominent and respected persons in the community signed a statement declaring, quote, "We never had any cause or grounds to suspect her of such thing as she is now accused of," unquote. And Sir William Phipps, Royal Governor of Massachusetts, granted her a reprieve. Theretofore, all power to do harm had automatically departed from witches and wizards once they were safely under lock and key. But Rebecca Nurse appears to have been an exceptionally powerful evildoer, for no sooner had the governor's reprieve been served on the Salem authorities than the children whose testimony had sworn her life away became afflicted as never before. Abigail Williams, the Reverend Mr. Parris's niece, was especially marked by her sufferings, and had her seizures in the most public places. The sight of her torments was too much for the neighbors. Representations were made to the governor by certain gentlemen of Salem, and the reprieve was withdrawn. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on Gallows Hill, July 19, 1692. In the dead of night her family crept stealthily to the unmarked grave into which her body had been tumbled by the hangman, exhumed her remains, and buried them in the family graveyard. No clergyman was present to read his office over her, for she had been excommunicated by the Reverend Mr. Parris, but her aged and sorrowing husband read from the Scripture such passages of love and forgiveness as seldom are heard from ordained clergymen of the fundamentalist school, and tears of grief watered the grave where the faithful wife and mother was laid beside her dear ones gone before. If meekness and forgiveness of those who despitefully entreat one accused falsely, and resignation to an unjust and undeserved fate constitute the essentials of a saint's character, then Salem, Massachusetts, is as surely entitled to claim golden-hearted Rebecca Nurse as its patron saint as any cathedral town of France or Flanders may claim patronage for some martyr who tasted death for the faith that was in him. Servants of Satan. Number 3, Rebecca Nurse, Saint of Salem. Number 4 of this series will treat the persecution, trial, and execution of the Reverend George Burroughs, one-time pastor of Salem Village Church. Edward E. French speaking. A copyright exists on all recordings issued by Edward E. French. Inquiries may be addressed to email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com.